fifth grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood Satellite.
This is a book that I really enjoyed. It's called Dying Every Day, Seneca at the Court of Nero by James Romm. So this concerns Rome, and we've talked about Rome before, but we always talked about Rome from a bird's eye view. We talked about, the Roman system, the history of Rome that spans over centuries, and we never really zoomed into, the human stories of what occurred in Rome. And we don't know, I'm not telling the story about your average citizen. This is a story about the great philosopher Seneca, who is in a very unique position as sort of the right-hand man of Emperor Nero in Rome. And this is a bit of a, not historical fiction, but it's like a historical narrative. So this story is told almost like it were an episode of Game of Thrones. Some people find that kind of hack. I like it. It's got a lot of, correct source material. It's got a lot of very, very good citations. So all this stuff did happen, but it's told in a very narratively focused way. But this story was so cool, and I thought this was necessary because when we talk about these political systems, we talk about history, I really think you need like an example to give you the context of how these systems operated at the time, to also not only say there's great Roman emperors, we should emulate these great philosopher kings. It's also important to look at really, really bad Roman emperors. It's important to show what happens when it goes horribly wrong, which is what this story is about. Now, I'll read the back here. Just a brief introduction. So, Dying Every Day is the first book to tell the compelling and nightmarish story of Seneca, the philosopher poet who was almost a king. The paragon of reason, Seneca watched as his student, Nero, spiraled into madness, a descent that saw 5 family murders, the fire of Rome, and a savage purge that destroyed the supreme minds of the Senate's golden age. As Nero's advisor, Seneca was presented with a complex set of choices. He was the only man capable of summoning the better aspect of Nero's nature, yet he remained at Nero's side and colluded in the evil regime he helped create. So right then, it's a real dramatic story. There's a lot of betrayal in this, and there's a lot of very vicious murder. And let me just say this, the Romans really knew how to kill each other and themselves. Suicide features very, very prominently in this book. Because there's one thing I'll get to in a little bit, but one rule, just to give you an example of what I'm talking about. So I think this was installed under Caligula, actually, because Caligula predated, he was the guy before Nero. And Nero, this king, this great emperor, he was elected not elected, but he came of age when he was a pretty young kid.
What we know for certain is Nero came to power when he was just 16. At an age when most kids are deciding which subjects to do for A-level, he was made ruler of half the world. Family connections were everything to the Romans. In terms of social standing, Nero had a great family. Although in terms of a healthy psychological background, they were a disaster. First, there was his father, a tough and brutal alcoholic called Gnaeus. This is a man who killed an ex-slave during a drinking bout, gouged out a fellow senator's eye when he criticised him in the forum, he deliberately killed a young boy in a traffic accident in a fit of road rage. But the real aristocratic blood came from his mother's side. Nero's story is about the women who influenced him, and central to that story is his mother Agrippina, the ultimate pushy woman. She created him, she made him, and in the end, she all but destroyed him.
So he was you saw the one thing that they warned you against, having a horny teenager as supreme emperor. That's what they
say that. They do say that. I've heard that.
That who's got the fucking game tape? We're always saying that here. But they had this thing where if you were executed by the state got all of your assets and all your land and everything, right? But there was a loophole where if you committed suicide before you were killed, you got to leave your inheritance to your family. So it entered into this like really strange, this strange scenario where like if you were charged for a crime, you're almost running to kill yourself. Like you didn't even want to go to trial because like, oh my God, I need to leave something for my kids. And sometimes the Caligula, he had two books of like when he wanted to do like big purges. One was called Cloak, one was called Sword, and one was called Dagger. And he's like, here's the list of names of people I need to execute. Here's the list of people we're gonna say we're gonna execute, but allow them to kill themselves. And they said there was like there's a few instances, and they didn't give the names, but there's some instances where like there's people being dragged to like to the execution, and they're still like trying to kill themselves as they're being taken to execution. Because if you did it before, they'd be like, rats.
You got away with it. Shit.
You got shit. Not again. Now we're gonna get in shit. And Seneca was a Stoic, so he's a great Stoic philosopher. So if you guys like Stoicism, if you guys like your Marcus Aurelius's, this is the guy for you.
He performed, right down to the last moments of his life, a theatrical suicide that would rival that of his hero, a Stoic philosopher and Roman senator named Cato the Younger, who famously disemboweled himself rather than live under Julius Caesar's tyranny. Unlike his hero, however, Seneca never got to taste any part of that freedom of Roman libertas that Cato and his predecessors had all enjoyed. Instead, he knew only of the empire. Seneca would live through the reigns of the first 5 emperors of Rome, and to say it was a time of tremendous violence, paranoia, and uncertainty would unfairly understate it.
I'm just gonna, just apart from the introduction, to set the stage and explain this guy. I like this part. He says, here is one way to describe the career of Seneca, writer, thinker, poet, moralist, and for many years, top advisor and close companion of Emperor Nero. By a strange twist of fate, a man who cherished sobriety, reason, and moral virtue found himself at the center of Roman politics. He did his best to temper the whims of a deluded despot, while continuing to publish the ethical treatises that were his true calling. When he could no longer exert influence on the palace, he withdrew and in solitude produced his most stirring meditations on virtue, nature, and death. And here's another way to describe the same life. A clever manipulator of undistinguished origin connived his way into the center of Roman power. He used his verbal brilliance to represent himself as a sage. He exploited his vast influence to enrich himself and touched off a rebellion in Britain by lending usuriously to its inhabitants. This actually did happen. After conspiring in or even instigating the palace's darkest crimes, he tried to rescue his reputation with his careful literary bullshit. So basically saying there's two versions of Nero. There's the good, honest, stoic, and then there's this other version that he's kind of portrayed in various other recountings at the time of like this fucked up guy who manipulated the poor Emperor Nero and who was maybe even worse than this crazy emperor. So that was always the people trying to reconcile these two historical accounts of this one guy. And like a lot of modern historians, they try and synthesize those two. Some people like that, some people don't. I think that's probably a more realistic way of going about it. Like, he's not like an evil worm tongue sort of guy, but you know, he provably did. You know, okay. So I'll start. I won't get ahead of myself right now. So the story of Seneca is actually kind of interesting. So he was this like a well-known Stoic philosopher at the time, and he was actually exiled for adultery, right? And he was exiled in a time when exile really meant something. Exile islands in Rome were more like a death sentence because I didn't know this because I never really looked into it. But when you were exiled from the kingdom, the empire, the imperium, you're pretty much sent to like a dead island to starve to death. Like, and I didn't know that. And oftentimes when they exiled you to the island, they make a big show of it and then send assassins later on to kill you. So the idea was like, even if you were exiled, you probably wouldn't survive very long. I had no idea of how common that was, but or they hoped that you would like go insane. But the funny thing was, as a Stoic, his entire life was training himself not to give a shit about materialism or the sensual nature of life itself. Like, you kind of just, a Stoic would make a prison for himself and be like, this is good, I like this.
It is inevitable, wrote Seneca, that life will be not just very short, but very miserable for those who acquire by great toil what they must keep by greater toil. They achieve what they want laboriously, they possess what they have achieved anxiously, and meanwhile they take no account of time that will never more return. New preoccupations take the place of the old, hope excites more hope, and ambition more ambition. They do not look for an end to their misery, but simply change the reason for it.
So this guy was exiled, but he was actually brought back out of exile to tutor Nero, because he was still a well-known guy. So they dragged him back there. So as a Stoic, they wanted to bring him in to teach this young guy Nero how to impart some of the Stoicism onto him. And what is Stoicism? Well, the Stoics were, and you can look them up. There's famous Stoic philosophers, but Stoics they're really obsessed with wanting nothing. Suicide was actually at the center of these beliefs. Like you're trying to purge yourself from desire, and suicide. In his writing, actually, Seneca's writing, there was a lot about how and when someone should commit suicide. And this is big at the time generally, because a lot of people these days would have a clean sweep of you should never commit suicide. Way more people committed suicide back then, and it was even seen as a good thing to do in the right circumstances. So that in the Stoic nature, they're like, yeah, you can commit suicide. In fact, sometimes it would actually be enlightened and beneficial to commit suicide. So he talked a lot about that. But because you're always trying to achieve the good beyond the material and to transcend petty nonsense. And if you could if you're in a position where to reject life would fulfill that, then you should take that. So, and what's interesting is that when you go back in history like this, sometimes you're just dealing with the records at the time. Like, a lot of historians hate that. A lot of modern historians hate that so much of ancient history hinges on great personalities and dynasties and personalities and things like that. But that is what it is. And the history of Rome always seems to come down to big personalities and family drama within the larger structure that contains them, like the Praetorian Guard. And so this is kind of what the previous king was in, Caligula, who's well known to a lot of people. They just know him as this kind of crazy, debauched king. I might, bring in some references from popular culture just so people can understand it. So, this would be a guy who would be like the Mad King from the Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones. Like an emperor that was so debauched and so crazy, and he was just killing people, that the Praetorian Guard, who are like his special elite, the top guys, the emperor's top guys, who are kind of like their own institution, like they were the top of the top.
At its peak, it had 8,000 elite soldiers. The Praetorian Guards were different from the other soldiers. They wore a darker uniform and could use purple, a very noble color in Roman culture. During the history of ancient Rome, the Praetorian Guard was used not only for the emperor's defense, but also to conduct less noble and honorable services, such as imprisoning and executing senators or anyone considered a threat.
They are the ones who actually killed Caligula, right? So, which was almost unheard of, like just to have like your own soldiers kill them. But they saw like this is enough after he went insane, and by doing that one time, the Praetorian Guard kind of got a reputation of being kingmakers, right? So it's like, oh, you're the guys. Like, it seems that the kings and emperors live or die by your approval. So all of a sudden, they centralize a bit of their power in the Juvenalian sense. So now, like, if you need to kill a king or kill an emperor, you better go to the Praetorian Guard first. They're like a mafia after that, which is kind of a cool transition of power. And they were instrumental in getting this guy named Claudius elected as emperor. And this was Nero's, not his father, his like stepfather. Now, Claudius was the guy who was chosen, and he elevated Nero as the next emperor after his own son, who was named Britannius. And this was all engineered by Nero's mom, who was named Agrippina. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, but she was, married to Claudius, and she had a son, and they had a son, so they're like stepbrothers, right? And so it was kind of crazy that this guy didn't even pick his own son to be the emperor. He picked this other one. And so the rumor mills were going at the time that, oh, this woman she's using her sexual devilish wiles to trick this guy. She's possessed him. And so she got this reputation in Rome of having like dark sexual magic, right? Which is a bad, like if you're the emperor, you don't want the people talking about how your wife is a magic whore.
Yeah, the queen consort is a magic whore. That's
Yeah,
wild.
yeah. She's just, oh my god, he made him do retarded things because her pussy game's so tight. But that was the talk of Rome. These old wives. And then so Seneca was brought in around this time to a young Nero to tutor him. So they're like, okay, we got to get this kid into shape to be the next emperor. So we're going to get this famous philosopher. He's got a whole bunch of teachers, but having a philosopher teach the future emperor is a big public display to get the people in line behind the emperor. It's like the modern parallel to that would be like, oh, this is the president went to Yale and Harvard. Like, we know he was educated the best. So this was almost a show being put on, but Seneca took it seriously. He was like, I'm going to teach this kid. Seneca, what's so fascinating is that this early on, you see the rumblings of what is essentially liberalism and what is essentially this idea of rationality, because the Stoics, they weren't about materialism. They weren't about really spirituality. They were about practicality, and they were about like trying to find the good life, cut through all the bullshit, and they're about individual liberty and rationality. And that's the thing. So Seneca, this philosopher, was like, we could have a new type of emperor. I can help make a new type of emperor that's more fair and has more of a appreciation of liberty and rights. Like, this was like he was like the John Locke of his day. That's how it was being proposed. And it's, if you read Stoicism literature, you probably get the same idea. So, but it was almost like this proto rationalism as far back. I just found that as an interesting parallel. And then so Nero comes in, Seneca comes in. Seneca rises up to the title of consul, and that's a high level. And he basically becomes filthy rich. So Seneca, again, the guy who was exiled for adultery, gets just estates all over the world. And then I was going to get into this later, but I'll get into this now. That another thing he was known for was instigating a rebellion in Britain, because Rome had a sway over Britain at the time, because apparently Seneca was employing usury too much. So he was just going to Britain and lending people money and like charging crazy high interest. And what did the people do? Well, they rose up against him and kind of like came after him. And so by this point, like, people were pissed off at Seneca. It's like, why are you being such a fucking Jew? Even back then, Seneca as the first rationalist and the first Jew. Yeah. So, and one example of what I was just saying was, so Seneca wrote this piece called De Ira, DE space IRA. It's it's a Stoic publication, and in there, he talks about how he was using Nero to try and destroy vengeance and pettiness. Because the idea, this was like the first turn the other cheek. Again, this predates Christ. So the Stoics were all like, live and let live, turn the other cheek. If someone offends you, laugh it off. We're trying to create a world that is we're trying to sweep away all this pettiness, all this dynastic bullshit. So, and there is a note in the book that around this time, you were starting to see the apostles go. There was around this time, they said, I believe it was Paul who might have been in Rome at the time, and he said there's some evidence that Seneca was aware that Paul was there and may have met him. They didn't go into that too much, but it's just to say, like, he was not a Christian by any stretch of the imagination, but he was already kind of playing around in some of the things that the early Christians were advocating for anyway. So I just thought that was like an interesting little tangent there. Now, how does Nero become an emperor? Well, his mother poisons the emperor. The emperor Claudius, he's poisoned. No one really knows how. Everyone assumes it's his wife, and now her boy gets to be emperor. Very, very young. Everyone suspected it, but no one knew what to do about it at the time. And for a while, this works very, very well. So they're seeing this young emperor start to get tutored, and he's going to be big. Around this time, Nero starts being a bit of a naughty boy. The power starts going to his head. And of course, the most obvious thing in the world happens if you know the dramatic arts. Him and his mother start vying for power because his mother thought she was going to be the power behind the throne. He's got other ideas. And she wants to hook him up with like his adopted sister, right? That's going to be your wife, your adopted sister. He doesn't want to do it. You know what he does do? He gets in with an Asian girl.
Whoa.
Yeah. He falls in love, falls head over heels with this fucking Asian girl he just sees in the palace one day. They start having an affair. He's breaking the rules. He's doing stuff that she doesn't want to do. So she even starts to be like, you know what? I don't like you anymore. I'm gonna pick your brother. You know, your father's real son. And so what does Nero do? He kills him. He kills Britannius. He uses the same poison that killed his adopted father on his son.
In that same year, Nero's adopted brother Britannicus died. Sources suggest that Nero had engaged the services of a poisoner, Locusta, after the emperor had become suspicious of Britannicus. Locusta was supposedly the same poisoner who had supplied the toxin to dispatch Claudius.
There is just one poison lady in the entirety of Rome. There's this one woman, I don't have her name here right now, but she's a recurring theme in the story because everyone who wants to poison has to buy poison from her, and she ends up so fucking successful. She opens a school of poisoning.
What? Are you serious?
Yeah, because she's the only one who can make this special poison.
What the fuck?
That can't be detected, that causes like a heart attack, and it works a certain way.
But she's publicly running a school to teach people how to do this?
She eventually did. She started like an assassin school.
Oh my god.
Like to teach the fine arts of poison making. So there's certain people in the story that just get away scot-free. So the winner in all this was the woman making poisons, because so many people get poisoned, and it proves to be such an effective way of getting rid of troublesome kids, I guess. Now, and around this time, so Nero can't be stopped, and he's kind of on the outs of his mother, but his mother, sort of like a Bene Gesserit from Dune, like she's still trying to be the power behind the throne in some way. But Nero, he's got a bad habit right now. The bad habit Nero has, and they don't know what to do about it, is he likes running around at night and molesting random people.
What?
Yeah, he's just a guy. He would get. He's a young man. You know what are you gonna do? He runs around molesting everyone because he can. No one did before. No one aside from. By the way, so they were trying to get Nero in because they said we can never have a repeat of Caligula. Because this is very Caligulan what he was doing, but like, no, we're gonna find a different guy. We're gonna raise him right. We're gonna make this kid a Stoic. Couldn't stop him from running around molesting the streets of Rome at night. Like, imagine just the king, just like in the shadows, like, ha ha, I got your penis, got your boobs. And he's a young guy, so what is he? He doesn't know anything about seduction, so he's bad at it as well.
Yeah,
you know,
he's like 14.
Yeah,
Jesus.
There was a funny story in here where he was trying to like molest this soldier's wife, and he beat the shit out of Nero, but he didn't know who he was. And so Nero goes back to his palace, all just like black eyes and bloody. He's just embarrassed because he's still a fucking kid. Then what happens is the soldier learns who he was and writes like an apology to him, like, I'm sorry, which was the one thing you're not supposed to do, because they could have just forgotten the whole thing. But now that he knew that the soldier knew it was him, then he had to kill the soldier. And then knowing that, then the soldier had to kill himself. That's the domino effect when you save your wife from being molested by this boy king, and then it's like, well, I got to kill myself now. Fucking hell. What a comedy of errors.
That's wild.
But again, like one of the reasons I like this is because it's a slice of life, is what it is. But it showed, because a lot of people on our side correctly would say that, you know, they're a lot of them are monarchists. A lot of people, they have an affection for the emperor. They have an affection for the type of strong man that can historically do. And there have been great emperors in Rome, but I like this as a case study of what happens if you get a bad one. Like, how badly can things go? And Nero, I'm not an expert on all the emperors of Rome. Nero seems like one of the worst because he was also annoying. So Nero, as he grows up, he doesn't really like being an emperor. What he wants to be is a poet. He wants to be an actor. He wants to be in plays. So, and he wants to sing, and he's obsessed with singing and getting. He does this instead of running Rome, right? But there's all these instances where, like, it's your typical dictator move where, like, I'm going to put on a show. Attendance is mandatory. And everyone better fucking clap. And it's just this and you have to, and also everyone's looking at this like, wow, look, our emperor is singing like a dandy. Right? Like seeing, if you saw Barack Obama address the nation and start rapping, I don't care how much of a shitlib you are, you'd be like, oh no, we've made a terrible mistake. If, you know, Trump kind of made a career off of doing that. That's a bit different though. But so seeing like the God Emperor being just singing and dancing around on stage, and even if he's bad, you need to clap. Like that would hurt your faith in your city state. And basically the book shows that within 5 years of becoming emperor, he essentially betrayed everything that he believed in. Because when Nero was brought on, he gave a big speech that was written by Seneca. That was kind of the role Seneca was doing, which he was not only tutoring Nero behind the scenes, he was also writing all his speeches, and he was trying to engineer what he thought was the perfect emperor, to be the perfect rationalist. And his speeches were very good. His speeches, he made a lot of high promises, but obviously those were used against him later. So I'll just read a part here. There's this other guy who's writing about this. He says, Cluvius gives us a painful picture of Seneca's role at court 5 years into the reign of Nero. The high-minded Stoic who had begun by setting Augustan goals and guidelines for the regime had been sucked ever deeper into the mire of family intrigue. He was struggling to hold on to his influence over Nero, believing he could still do some good. But the methods he now had to use were expedient to the extreme. To act as imperial panderer, dispatching an ex-slave to the princeps to stop him from sleeping with his mother, brandishing Burrus and the guard as an implicit threat. These were hardly roles to be envisioned when he returned to Rome from Corsica, his trunk full of ethical treatises. So by this point, yeah, there's a point where Nero was essentially trying to fuck his mother too. Just for like a minute, he was trying to do that. Then he stopped. That their relationship was very fraught with peril, and Nero was probably raised in a weird way by his domineering, power-hungry mom. So that whole relationship was strained. He eventually kills her. By the way, he kills everyone. That's the thing. He tries to kill Nero. The entire arc of this story is increasingly Nero gets more and more paranoid, insane, and just starts sending assassins after everyone, which is line for line what Caligula did. And then so eventually the Praetorian Guard had to try and step in. But this was, you know, just a story of trying to do everything right and trying to... It seemed relevant. It seemed relevant even today, this belief that you could... The pitfalls of trying to be like a shadow puppeteer to the main power. But ultimately, sometimes your best laid plans don't work if you just have a psycho at the helm. You can't use all your cloak and dagger machinations to do anything. If you have just a strong personality who really believes he's the God King, he can just make up rules, which is what Nero did. It was like it truly was like, you know, a political realism versus high-minded philosophy, a duel between the two. and seeing, and it turns out nobody wins. It turns out everyone ends up with their wrists slit. Nero, just to flesh that part out, Nero decides to kill his own mother around 10 years in. At this point, he's surrounded by just sycophants and freaks. The way he tries to kill his mother, because she actually tries to kill him, she's been plotting against him the entire time. He knows she's plotting against him. That's probably the one thing he is correctly paranoid about. So he does this crazy thing where he tries to kill her to make it look like an accident at first. Like, he basically pays for her to go on this elaborate cruise and sinks the boat, hoping that she'll drown. But she doesn't drown. She survives. She plays dead. And she kind of knows what's going on, so she flees. She makes it back to her palace, at which point he just sends like an army of assassins to kill her. And at that point, everyone knew he did it. Like, there was no plausible deniability. But he's at a point where he's just, I don't give a shit. And then what are you going to do? Then like he kills his own wife. His wife was named Octavia. He was married to her, but never loved her. Was always sleeping around, finding every type of Asian girl in the place, getting a whole harem of fucking Asian girls. He gets her killed. Not even sure why. He just does. He just doesn't like her. He just hates the bitch that he's saddled to. But they needed like an official queen, so he ends up getting her killed. He finds I have the note here. A woman named Poppaea. Poppaea, who is a shrewd, cunning whore woman. That's the note I put. So I think I was probably right when I said that. So basically he gets his wife Octavia killed because she gets pregnant, and then once she's pregnant, he exiles her to an island and then kills her on the island. Like, these very convoluted murder plots. And also at this point, he starts assassinating all of his relatives because he's got uncles. He's paranoid that anyone within his family, if anything happens to him, they could become emperor. So he's trying to destroy any contender for the throne. So he's sending armies of assassins to kill all of his uncles and his aunts and his old friends, his old advisors. And at this point, Seneca is thinking, well, why wouldn't he kill me? And most of these people were already in fucking exile. The uncles he had killed were exiled on an island. He went to go fucking kill them anyway. And by this point, the paranoia is seeping in, and he's starting to suspect Seneca, his old tutor, the guy who practically raised him. Because at this point, Seneca's like, he realizes he can't do anything with this guy. So he's just like, well, I'm just going to do usury now on my estates. But then, Nero's just like, I'm going to try and kill you anyway. But at the same time, the only thing that really delays that for the longest time is because there's the event that I talked about in the beginning, known as like the Fire of Rome.
Rome burns for 9 days. The devastation is massive.
The Fire of 64 is an outstanding event. It's a rare event. Fires before then were frequent in Rome, but not on this scale. Most of the city is destroyed.
It is what it sounds like. It was a giant inferno that destroyed 2/3 of Rome. 2/3 of the city was up in smoke. And there's this whole myth that might have been real, but no one can confirm it, but it would be fitting for Nero. There's a story of like Rome engulfed in flames, and he's in his tower just playing his fucking lyre, like the little instrument, and singing away because he was a guy who liked to sing. Just the picture of an unconcerned emperor as the entire city burns. He's not concerned. He's more concerned with his singing. It could be true. I would believe it. But that's kind of, when you talk about Nero, that's like the image a lot of people will get. And Nero was kind of blamed for it. No one really knows why, but they just blamed Nero because they didn't like him. They tended to think he was an artsy, narcissistic asshole, so they just thought, I guess, he was responsible through some neglect. He decides to rebuild it, plus build a fucking 100-acre golden house of pleasure. So instead of rebuilding I'll rebuild the city, but at the center of it, I'm going to build a giant whorehouse just for me. And then he does, and he begins a massive shakedown on everyone to afford it. He says it was they said the greatest transfer of wealth since Alexander the Great. They said they turned Rome into a Neronopolis, basically a city just for his own pleasure, and him just calling in all his debts and like doing invasions just to afford this insane expense of his. And then I'll wrap this up now because I know we gotta keep going. The story ends by the Praetorian Guard, the senators, the aristocrats all plot to assassinate Nero. They bring in Seneca to help them because Nero is basically trying to poison him anyway. So Seneca thought, "What the fuck? I might as well." He kept trying to retire. He kept trying to leave Nero's side, and Nero wouldn't let him. It's one of those like mafia things where he's like, "I'm old now. What am I going to do?" He's like, "Well, I don't think I could live without you. I'm sure you couldn't live either." Like that sort of thing. So it's like, okay. But he desperately wanted to just go away, but wasn't being allowed to. So they tried to form a plot. The plot ultimately failed. And then like all these senators started getting killed. He did a massive purge of the Senate, just murdering everyone at this point. Like, why not? Ultimately, they do finally send someone to try and kill Seneca after the coup fails. Seneca's on the run. He's unpopular by this point because there are mechanisms within the system to depose an emperor. Usually it takes a while to kick in, especially in Rome, but he was on the run. He was unpopular. And he knew, Nero knew that people were coming to kill him. And then he wanted to do the thing. It's like, I'm not going to let them kill him. I'm going to kill myself like a good Stoic, like Seneca, that asshole, taught me. So he said, first of all, he tries to kill himself by slitting his wrists. And that doesn't work right away. So then he starts slitting his ankles. That doesn't work right away. So he's standing there bleeding from the wrists and ankles. Then he's like, oh my God. Then he starts taking hemlock to poison himself. And then that's not working. So he's bleeding and coughing and choking. So he stumbles into one of his like big baths. They have these like steam rooms and just chokes to death on steam. Like the worst suicide that's ever been attempted. Yeah, so it's like after the Holocaust of killing all his enemies, Nero eventually caused a rebellion and ends by killing himself in the most hilariously poor fashion. Now, I just wanted to... That's the end of Nero. And that's the end of the story of Nero and Seneca. Seneca, the philosopher who tried to engineer the perfect, rational, Stoic emperor and just ended up failing. And it wasn't even his fault. I guess that's the moral of the story, that when you put the philosophy up against just dynastic politics and family intrigue, I think the family intrigue wins. And you know, it doesn't matter how much philosophy he had. You can't stop a crazy kid from trying to fuck his mom.
Yep.
What do you think of all that? I know it wasn't as deep and as academic as some of the stuff we go into, but I just thought that was a great story.
It's just history. It's just history.
This is the type of stuff that was going on.
Yeah. I
like all the stuff we talk about what happened in Rome and how Rome functions.
Yeah.
Seeing it in action.
So I was gonna say, it's like, damn, it is just like us.
It is
pretty much just like us.
It is. It's the same.
Shit, that's what I would do.
Look, it's like they said, what if we made Epstein president?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think we tried it and we saw what happened. You end up with a 100-acre port whorehouse made of gold. And I assume there was children in there too.
Oh,
Like imagine that little fucking church on, what was it, Little St. James Island, whatever it was called. Imagine that the size of Manhattan. that was the Neronopolis.
Call it Big St. James. Nero and Big St. James.
Yeah.
Fuck.
And it's a great book. I recommend people watch it, especially people who have an interest in Stoicism. I thought it was a really fascinating insight on the development of Stoicism, which isn't really taken seriously that much anymore. It's kind of a meme on our side, but I've got a great appreciation for the Stoics and what the philosophical project that they were trying to execute at such an early stage of human development. Right? Again, this was around the time of Christ.
Well, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of like lifestyle coaches, like center libertarian, like wealthier guys, like what is it, like the startup scene, There's a lot of guys that are Stoics now. Like, that's going around again. Yeah, I heard about that. That it's just like that, and like Buddhist meditation is kind of in the same thing of like ways to manage stress and leadership and shit. So
yeah, it's all about moving past the pleasures, moving past, you know, the senses, the world of the senses, to try and find some ontological, not a divinity, but some kind of to live the good life is what they would say.
Yeah.
And the good life through a sort of non-materialistic rationality. And I guess that's its staying power, really.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I guess that couldn't stop Caligula too from happening, and making so many people commit suicides. It was kind of sad reading about. Like, I don't think he was. He obviously wasn't manipulative and evil. Like, I think he genuinely did try. When you see the early speeches he wrote for Nero, it was all these high-minded ideals. It was all these, like, you know, all that bullshit that just happened is over.
Yeah.
You know, this is a new dawn is rising, and it turns out, like, don't let your daughters, literally don't lock up your daughters, because the king is grabbing at titties.
Yep, he's coming.
He's coming around. He's flicking the tip of your penis. And you
was,
can't say
too.
anything. Yeah.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.